Hi guys, and welcome to Last Light Radio Channel. Tonight we slip into the dim, uncertain world of 1830, where the edge of America is not a neat line on a schoolroom map, but a place of wagon ruts, cold dawns, and promises that sound much sweeter than they live. You can almost hear the creak of the wheel rims before sunrise, the soft fussing of chickens in rough crates, and the low murmur of families pretending they are not afraid. What kind of life would make a mother leave a settled hearth, a father gamble everything on distant acreage, and children trade familiar lanes for forests full of whispers? The answer is part hope, part hardship, and part plain human stubbornness. So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And while you're getting comfortable, tell me your location and local time in the comments, because somewhere out there, someone else is listening in the same hush. Now, dim the lights, and you find yourself in a world where land is never just land. It is hunger answered. It is debt escaped. It is pride, inheritance, and a long shot at freedom wrapped into one rough patch of earth. In 1830, that promise hangs over countless farmsteads in the old estates, especially where families have grown larger but fields have not. You stand in a cramped eastern farmhouse and feel the truth of it in the boards under your feet. The floor is worn smooth by years of use. The air smells of ash, wool, and last night's supper. Outside, the yard is muddy from the spring thaw, and beyond it the familiar fields seem smaller than they once did, as if the soil itself has started to shrink under the pressure of too many hands. You're not poor in the most dramatic way. That is the tricky part. You have a roof, you have tools, you have a cow that gives milk when the season is kind. Yet the arithmetic of daily life has grown mean. Sons are becoming men, and each hopes for land of his own. Daughters need dowries, clothes, and some sort of future beyond endless spinning. A father may divide a property only so many times before every child receives a strip too narrow to live on. So the idea of the frontier starts to glow in the mind like a candle in a dark room, dim, flickering. Not entirely trustworthy, but hard to ignore. The newspapers help. So do travellers' tales. So do letters carried back from cousins who swear the western soil is black and deep enough to swallow a plough to its handle. You hear stories of Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, and places farther still, where timber is thick, game is plenty, and land can sometimes be bought for prices that sound almost indecently low. The federal government has made western land more attainable for ordinary white settlers through policies that break it into smaller parcels. That matters. It is one thing to dream of owning land. It is another to imagine you might actually reach it with cash, grit, and a willingness to sleep on the ground. Not every story is honest. Naturally not. The frontier has always had excellent advertising. Mud rarely appears in a land pitch, neither do fever, loneliness, or the charming fact that a tree root can ruin your day before breakfast. But hope has a way of polishing rough facts until they shine. You hear that a family can start over there, really start over, and you want to believe it. Many did believe it. Some were fleeing debt, some wanted better soil, some wanted distance from crowded towns and rising land prices. A few simply carried a restless streak that made any horizon feel like a personal invitation. You feel that restless pull in the community around you, at church steps, at mill doors, at market stalls. People talk in lowered voices about going west. One family sold off half their furniture, another traded a mare for a wagon tongue and iron fittings. Someone's brother wrote from Ohio that corn grew high as a man's chest. Someone else muttered that he also buried 2 children there. Both things can be true at once. On the frontier, they often are. The decision is rarely sudden, even when later generations tell it like a single bold leap. In truth, it is usually a slow drip of necessity. A crop fails. A debt lingers. Rent rises. A child marries and needs room. A neighbour leaves and sends back a letter full of hopeful exaggeration. Then one evening, after the chores are done and the fire has fallen to a red glow, the talk turns serious. You sit at a rough table, elbows near a candle stub, and hear the question spoken aloud. Should we go? That small question changes the room. The silence after it feels thick as wool. You can hear the tick of cooling iron near the hearth, You can smell tallow smoke and damp boots drying by the fire. No one says yes right away. No one sensible would. Going west is not a holiday. It is not a cheerful carriage outing with pies in a basket. It means selling what cannot be carried, leaving graves behind, and trusting roads that are often more rumour than road. It means choosing uncertainty on purpose, which is either brave or slightly absurd, depending on whether the weather is fair. Still, families keep choosing it. The reason is simple enough. Staying put can be its own danger. In parts of the east and upper south, good farmland is increasingly expensive. Overworked fields produce less. Tenant arrangements leave little room for independence. Men who own nothing substantial answer to men who own too much. On the frontier, by contrast, labour may be punishing, but at least it is your own punishing labour. That difference matters more than comfort. It matters more than elegance ever could. You begin to see how the frontier appeals not just to ambition but to dignity. To possess your own acreage, however raw, means more than profit. It means decision. It means your children may inherit something solid. It means each tree you fell answers to your hand and not another man's orders. The dream is not luxury. The dream is control over your own household, your own field, your own future. In 1830, that kind of independence has moral weight. It is spoken of almost as a duty. A man should provide. A family should improve itself. Land makes that possible, at least in theory. Women often carry a more complicated set of feelings. You feel them too. A mother may understand the need to move while also knowing exactly what the move will cost in labour, safety, and exhaustion. She thinks of pregnancies on the road, of children sick with fever, of baking without a proper oven, of water that must be hauled farther than anyone admits. She thinks of leaving neighbours who can appear at the door in a crisis. Yet many women also share the hope. They want a farm their sons can work, a place their daughters might marry well, a household with room to grow. Some are pushed by husbands, some urge the journey themselves. Frontier life is not shaped by men alone. However loudly men sometimes narrate it, children absorb the mood in their own strange way. They hear fragments. They hear the word West spoken with equal parts excitement and dread. They watch adults sort tools, patch harness, and count coins. They sense change before they understand it. For some children, the idea feels like adventure. New streams, new forests, maybe even bears if they are lucky and not too close. For others, it feels like the end of the known world. They know the path to the spring, the smell of the barn in rain, the tree where they hide from chores for 6 glorious minutes. Leaving those things is no small sorrow, and sorrow does exist, though people do not always dwell on it in memory. Frontier stories are often told with heroic polish, all axe strokes and sturdy smiles. The quieter truth is softer and sadder. Families leaving older settlements often left behind parents too old to travel, married sisters rooted where they were, and burial plots that held babies and grandparents. A simple departure could tear a family network in half. The frontier offered land, yes, but it also demanded separation as an entry fee. You step outside at dusk and listen to the ordinary sounds of the yard. A bucket knocks gently against the well frame. A dog circles once in the dust before settling down. Somewhere beyond the fence a neighbour calls to his son. It is almost unbearable how normal it all feels. That is often the moment when the decision hardens, not in noise, but in stillness. You understand what you're about to lose, and that understanding gives the choice its real weight. There are practical calculations. Of course. Always practical calculations. A family must think about routes, seasons, animals, tools, and money. Spring departures are common because roads improve, and new land can be planted by arrival if fortune smiles. Autumn moves happen too, though wintering in a half-built shelter is a truly dreadful way to test your faith. Some families travel in groups for safety and companionship. Others go with only their own household, which is either confidence or a serious misreading of the situation. Not all frontier migrants are the same. Some are native-born Americans moving again after earlier migrations. Some are recent immigrants from Europe who first settle in eastern states, then push farther inland. Some come from New England, some from Pennsylvania, some from Virginia and the Carolinas. They carry different accents, church habits, recipes, and expectations. On the road west, these habits jostle together like cookware in a wagon bed. Frontier culture is never one thing. It is a patchwork made under pressure. There is also a harder truth beneath the hopeful one. When pioneer families imagine empty land, it is often not empty at all. Indigenous nations have lived on and shaped these landscapes for generations. By 1830, the same year hanging over your story, the Indian Removal Act becomes law in the United States, deepening a violent policy of dispossession in the South and beyond. Many settler families either ignored this reality, accepted it, or benefited from it without much reflection. A calm bedtime voice cannot honestly smooth that away. The frontier was not simply found. It was taken, contested, and remade through power as much as toil. Even among historians, some debates remain unsettled. Scholars still disagree over how much frontier migration was driven by desperate need and how much by cultural ambition, that deep American habit of chasing expansion because the nation had come to expect it. Both motives likely mingled in most households. People rarely move for one clean reason. They move because debts pinch, because neighbours boast, because land tempts, because policy opens a door, because pride whispers, because children need room, because staying feels like sinking slowly into the same worn floorboards forever, and so the household begins to lean toward departure. Quietly at first, then with more force. Extra candles are not bought because money must be saved. Broken tools get mended instead of replaced. Cloth is patched again. Livestock values are discussed. A wagon is inspected with almost devotional seriousness. The very texture of daily life changes once westward motion enters the plan. Every object in the house suddenly has a question hanging over it. Useful, or not useful, worth carrying, or worth selling essential, or sentimental frontier life begins before the road does. It begins the moment a family turns its home into a list. Yet for all the stern calculation, there are moments of pure imagination, delicious moments. You picture your own field stretching wide under sun. You picture a cabin placed exactly where you want it, with no landlord, no rent, no elder brother inheriting the best part. You picture orchards not yet planted, children grown taller, smoke rising from your chimney on land that answers to your name. It is a fragile dream. Still, it glows. That glow keeps you moving through fear. Because fear is there, always there, tucked beneath the hope like cold earth under grass. You fear sickness on the route. You fear wagons breaking. You fear arriving too late to plant. You fear wolves a little, though disease and weather are usually the more efficient enemies. You fear regret most of all. Not dramatic regret, just the slow kind, the kind that sits beside you every winter if you fail. So you stand in 1830 at the edge of a choice shared by thousands of pioneer families. Behind you is familiarity, crowded and constricting. Ahead lies distance, labour, and a chance at ownership that feels almost holy. The room smells of smoke and wool, the candle gutters. Outside, the dark presses softly against the window, and in that hush, with the whole rough continent seeming to breathe beyond the trees, you understand why so many families rose from their chairs, tightened their hands around the future, and said yes. Morning comes grey and thin, and your house no longer feels like a house. It feels like a question. Every shelf, peg, chest, and corner asks what kind of life can be folded, tied, hammered shut, and jolted over rough miles without falling to pieces. You stand in the middle of the room while the hearth gives off a faint warmth and the smell of old ash. The walls still hold familiar things, but familiar things are now under judgment. A frontier journey is a ruthless editor. It cuts the decorative, trims the sentimental, and squints hard even at comfort. Hacking begins with confidence, that never lasts. At first, the task seems simple enough. Take what you need, leave what you do not. Then the real trouble starts. Because need is not a tidy category. A kettle is clearly needed. A second kettle feels wise. A third is absurd until someone reminds you that a handle may crack 200 miles from help. Axes are needed. A draw knife is needed. A hoe, spade, auger, iron wedges, nails, flint, whetstone, sewing needles, thread, salt, seed, cooking pots, blankets, a Bible, spare harness leather, lantern, soap, medicines, and rope all step forward like eager candidates. Soon the wagon looks smaller than a cradle. The wagon itself deserves sober attention. You run a hand along the wood and feel rough grain, sun-dried and slightly warm by afternoon. The iron tires on the wheels matter more than almost anything else. A family may dream grandly, but a cracked wheel rim will bring theology down to earth in one sharp instant. Wagons used by many pioneer families in 1830 are practical farm wagons rather than the larger covered wagons people often imagine from later westward migrations. They are sturdy, not spacious. A canvas top may be stretched over bowed frames, but many are simply loaded with chest, sacks, tools, and bedding, then covered against weather as best as possible. Romance shrinks quickly when you realize your entire household must fit into something built more for hauling produce than preserving domestic dignity. Weight becomes a tyrant. Lift a chest once and it seems manageable. Fill it with iron tools, winter clothing, family plates, and that extra skillet your mother insists is essential. And suddenly 2 men grunt like oxen just shifting it a few feet. Every pound placed in the wagon asks another question. Does it earn its place? Can the horses or oxen pull it through mud? Can it survive river crossings, steep grades, and axle strain? No one wants to speak too plainly, but everyone knows a grim truth. The road may choose for you. Things not abandoned in the yard may be abandoned in the wilderness. Furniture is often the first heartbreak. Large tables, bedsteads, tall cupboards, and chairs that have held a family for years suddenly turn into burdens too expensive to love. You watch them with a strange resentment, as if they have betrayed you by being made of honest wood. A broad feather bed sounds comforting until you try to imagine hauling it through rain and dust. Some families take one bed and strip the rest for ticking or fabric. Others leave all but blankets and quilts. A loom may stay behind. A cradle may be given to kin. The room begins to empty in patches, and the emptiness is unsettling. Every bare spot on the wall says this is happening. Clothing must be chosen with the same cold eye. Fine dresses and Sunday coats may still matter, because even pioneer families need church clothes, courtship clothes, burial clothes, something that reminds them they are not livestock. Yet work garments dominate the packing pile. Linen shirts, wool petticoats, coarse trousers, aprons, stockings, shawls, cloaks, hats, sturdy shoes, and extra patches of cloth go in. Children often have fewer changes than anyone would like. Clothes will be mended again and again on the road and after arrival. A missing button is not a crisis. A missing pair of shoes can become one. Food stores carry both comfort and calculation. Flour is precious but heavy. Cornmeal travels better. Salt pork, bacon, dried beans, hard cheese, coffee when affordable, tea if treasured, molasses if a jug can be spared, and sacks of seed, corn or wheat, all compete for room. A mother fingers a small bag of dried apples and thinks of winter. A father weighs a barrel and thinks of the team pulling it uphill. Even simple food has to justify itself by nourishment, keeping quality and packability. Glass jars are risky. Crockery is heavy. Anything that sloshes, leaks, cracks, or spoils becomes suspicious. Frontier packing turns ordinary groceries into military decisions. Then there are the tools, the true bones of the journey. Many pioneer households would sooner leave a chair than an axe, sooner leave a quilt than a saw. A family might manage weeks without comfort, but not long without implements for building and clearing. The smell of oiled metal hangs in the air as blades are wrapped, sharpened, and counted. Gunpowder and shot may be packed if the family owns a firearm, useful for hunting and defense, though ammunition is another weight to justify. A hatchet can serve a dozen needs. A missing auger can delay building. An iron pot can boil dinner and soap alike. On the frontier, tools are almost members of the household. Women often manage much of the finer logic of packing, though their labour is too easily described as helping. It is not helping. It is organising the survival of the family. You see hands sorting herbs for remedies, bundling linens, folding baby clothes into corners of chests, tucking away needles, scraps, and twine that a careless man might dismiss as trifles. Those trifles mend shirts, close wounds, tie bundles, patch sacks, and save hours of misery. The domestic arts are not decorative out here, they are structural. A woman who knows how to pack a small store of dried mint, goose grease, bandages, and sturdy thread may be carrying more practical security than a man boasting over an extra hammer. Children drift through this sorting like uneasy ghosts. At first they treat it as play. They climb on trunks, sneak peeks into bags, or march about with wooden spoons pretending to lead an expedition. Then they notice favourite objects set aside. A doll does not make the cut. A rag ball disappears into the sell pile. A small stool, a painted cup, a shell from some distant visit, all are judged and often rejected. Tears may come over things adults find trivial, yet children understand value in a different currency. A worn toy is proof that life once felt settled. Some items survive because they carry a household's identity. A Bible frequently travels, sometimes tucked in cloth as carefully as silver. Family records may be written inside it, births and deaths in faded ink. A clock, if small enough and dear enough, may come along, so might a spinning wheel part, a treasured pewter spoon, or a few books. Many families carried little reading matter beyond scripture and perhaps an almanac, but those few pages could anchor memory and routine. The frontier strips life down, yet people still try to preserve tokens of order, belief, and self-respect. A curious detail appears in many accounts of moving households. Seeds often receive almost tender attention. Corn, beans, squash, cabbage, turnip, pumpkin, onion, and herb seeds can represent the difference between a household merely arriving and a household taking root. You hold a seed sack in your palm and it feels nearly weightless. Strange, really. A few ounces of dry kernels and promise. Historians still argue whether families were always as strategic with seed selection as later memoirs suggest, because memory loves to make ancestors sound methodical. Still, the practical importance is clear. When people pack seed, they are not just carrying food, they are carrying next season. Medicines are another uneasy category. Frontier medicine in 1830 is a mixture of practical care, folk knowledge, home remedy, and alarming confidence. A family might pack castor oil, laudanum, calomel, camphor, or simple herbal preparations. Some of these relieve, some likely worsen matters. The medicine box rattles softly and smells bitter when opened. A little chest of hope and hazard together. Leeches probably stay behind, which feels like one of history's more encouraging packing choices. But simple remedies for fever, bowel trouble, coughs, and wounds are guarded carefully. On the road, a small vial can feel more precious than money. Packing also creates an economy of farewell. Items not taken must be sold, traded, gifted, or stored. Neighbours come by and inspect possessions with practical eyes. A table that once hosted your family meals is now appraised like a mule. There is no malice in it. That is simply how departure works. You hear boots on the porch, low bargaining voices, the scrape of furniture shifted across the floor. The house smells of dust newly stirred from places usually undisturbed. Something almost theatrical happens in these days. Private life becomes public inventory. Auctions, informal sales, and quiet exchanges break up the household piece by piece. A skillet goes to an aunt. A chest goes cheap to a neighbour who knows you cannot take it. Some buyers are fair, some become suddenly talented at understating value. You learn that sentiment has poor market price. A hand-quilted coverlet may represent months of labour, but if it is worn, it fetches little. A scythe in good condition may matter more than a decorative mirror ever did. Cash is needed, though often scarce, so pride must swallow many insults. The frontier journey begins with the humiliating knowledge that your life can be priced by the yard and pound. Not all possessions are sold, some are hidden away with relatives in hopes of return. That choice contains its own little drama. To store an object is to admit you may come back, or at least that you cannot bear finality just yet. A chest left in a brother's loft says perhaps. A clock left wrapped in linen says we are not sure. People like to picture pioneers as all resolve and muscle. but uncertainty sits among the bundles as surely as any skillet. Religious feeling often intensifies during packing days. You notice it in the prayers spoken longer than usual, in the careful wrapping of the family Bible, in the way a mother pauses before closing a trunk and briefly bows her head. Many frontier families understood movement through a spiritual lens. Providence opened the path. Providence would protect the children. Providence, one hoped, would do something about axle grease and ague. Ministers sometimes preached against worldly ambition, yet many also blessed migration as honest striving. The line between trust in God and trust in luck could grow very thin on a muddy road. There is, too, the matter of appearances. Even on the brink of upheaval, families care how they are seen. Bedding is rolled neatly, shirts are folded, cooking ware is nested with surprising elegance. A wagon load may become a display of competence if things are tied down properly, if the harness shines a little, if the children are clean enough to suggest discipline, then a family can leave with dignity. This matters because departure is public. People watch. They judge. Some admire the boldness. Others predict failure before the wheels even turn. A quirky little truth from the era is that certain utterly ordinary objects became emotional lightning rods. A butter chirp, for instance, could spark more debate than a rifle. Take it, and it consumes room. Leave it, and you lose a daily tool of household economy. The same goes for bake kettles, extra buckets, or spare shoes for growing children. Great life changes are often narrated with lofty words, yet the real drama sometimes circles a lard tin and a bag of nails. By the final days, the house grows strange in sound and touch. Rooms echo more. Floorboards feel colder when rugs are rolled. The tick of a small clock seems louder against walls stripped of shelves and pegs. Smoke from the hearth drifts through a space that no longer answers with the soft clutter of home. You brush your fingers over the smoother lid of a packed chest and sense the compressed pressure of all that remains. There is comfort inside, but not enough of it. There are tools inside, but perhaps not the one you forgot. Packing always leaves the nagging fear that the true essential has been left in some corner only memory will find later. When the wagon is finally loaded, it does not look grand. It looks crowded, awkward, and faintly alarming. Ropes bite into canvas. Iron gleams dull in morning light. Barrels sit beside bedding. A spinning wheel piece peeks from under a quilt. A skillet knocks against a box when the load shifts. Children stare at it all as if their home has been translated into a language of knots and wood. In a way, it has. You stand back and see the plain truth of pioneer family life at the edge of departure. A whole domestic world has been reduced to what can be pulled by animal strength over imperfect roads into uncertain country. Every item aboard the wagon is a compromise between necessity and longing. Every item left behind is a quiet surrender. The smell of a leather, canvas, meal sacks, and fresh-cut rope fills the yard. Hands are sore, tempers are thin, decisions are final, and still, beneath the fatigue, there is a pulse of stubborn hope. You have turned a settled home into a travelling household. You have measured love against weight and usefulness against grief. You have discovered that survival on the frontier begins not with heroics, but with selection. Not grand speeches, just choices, hard, ordinary, relentless choices made one object at a time. The road begins with noise. Wheels groan before sunrise. Harness chains clink in the chill air. Oxen breathe in slow white clouds, and horses stamp at flies that have already found them, though the day has barely opened its eyes. You climb up, settle among sacks and rolled bedding, and feel the whole wagon tremble as weight shifts over the axles. Then comes the first lurch forward, awkward and heavy, as if the earth itself is reluctant to let you go. Travel in 1830 is rarely smooth, and almost never quick. What passes for a road may be little more than a pair of deep ruts through woodland, a strip of churned clay between farms, or a half-cleared trace marked by broken branches and other people's bad decisions. In dry weather, dust rises in pale sheets and settles over hair, collars, kettles, and eyelashes until everyone looks lightly breaded. In wet weather, the same road becomes a long brown argument with gravity. Wheels sink, boots stick, Animals strain with a sound somewhere between effort and complaint. You feel every mile in the body. The wagon bed jolts hard enough to rattle teeth. Boards thump beneath you. A bump catches your spine. Another throws a child sideways into a sack of meal, which is softer than the floor but not much kinder. Even those who walk beside the wagon fare little better. Mud sucks at shoes. Stones bruise feet. Roots catch the careless. A day's journey might cover only a modest distance. Yet by evening, it can seem you have been shaken for a year. Families often try to start early. While the air is cool and animals are freshest, dawn on the road has its own mood, brisk and uncertain. The smell of damp canvas mixes with manure, leather, cold ash from the breakfast fire, and coffee if anyone has enough to spare. Sometimes there is only a hot drink made from roasted grain or herbs, the sort of beverage politely called coffee by people determined to keep morale alive. It warms the hands, at least, on the frontier. Names can be generous when ingredients are not. The procession itself is a curious sight. Some families travel alone, their wagon rocking ahead like a small island of possessions. Others move in loose company with neighbours or newly made companions. A few miles of shared hardship can create fast intimacy. You learn who curses under the breath, who ties knots well, who fusses over children, who claims to know the route and then peers at every fork like a man reading tea leaves. Group travel offers safety, advice, and extra hands for trouble, though it also multiplies opinions, which have broken many a calm morning more effectively than rain. Rivers interrupt the journey with a special kind of dread. A narrow stream may only require careful driving through a stony bed. A wider crossing becomes a full family crisis. Water hides depth badly, and current rather well. Wheels slip, animals balk, boots fill, the wagon tilts just enough to make every heart thud against the ribs. You listen to the splash around the hubs and pray the load holds steady. A barrel shifts. A child gasps. Someone shouts advice from the bank, much of it contradictory and all of it urgent. When the crossing succeeds, relief arrives in a dizzy wave. When it fails, bedding, flour, tools, and precious dry clothing can be soaked in minutes. Ferries exist in some places, though they are not always convenient, cheap, or reassuring. You roll onto a flatboat, feel it dip beneath the load, and try not to imagine the whole arrangement drifting sideways into disaster. Fees bite into limited funds, waiting times stretch tempers. Still, a proper ferry can spare an axle and a family's nerves. It is one of those small frontier luxuries that feels extravagant only because the alternatives are so disagreeable. Breakdowns haunt the road, a loose wheel, a snapped trace, a cracked tongue, a bent axle pin, a split board. Any of these can stop progress cold. You do not need grand tragedy to ruin a day. One modest failure of wood or iron will do the work nicely. Then tools come out. Men crouch in dust or mud. Women hold children back from wandering underfoot while also unpacking what must be reached. Everyone becomes familiar with the wagon's underside in a way no one ever desired. The smell of hot metal and fresh-shaved wood hangs in the air during repairs, along with the sharp temper that comes from hunger and delay. Oxen are slower than horses, but often steadier and better suited to heavy hauling. Horses move faster and can look much finer doing it, but they tire differently and require more careful management. Mules earn admiration for toughness and disapproval for attitude, often both in the same hour. Animals are not background scenery in this life. They are essential partners in motion, and their health shapes the whole journey. A lame ox can halt everything. A horse with colic can darken the mood of an entire camp. People watch their teams closely, noting sweat, breathing, appetite, and gait with the same anxious attention they give their children. Children on the road learn quickly that travel is mostly waiting, interrupted by discomfort. They wait for breakfast, for the wagons to move, for rivers to be crossed, for adults to settle arguments, for camp to be made, for one more mile to become the last mile of the day. Small children cry from heat, boredom, and chafing clothes. Older ones are expected to help. They fetch water, gather chips and sticks, mind younger siblings, lead a cow, hold a nervous horse, or walk for long stretches to spare the wagon team extra burden. They also invent games from almost nothing because childhood, stubborn thing that it is, survives even in rutted mud. Sometimes the road passes through settlements where supplies can be bought or news exchanged. Taverns, mills, smithies, and general stores become points of relief and temptation. You can smell frying meat from an inn-yard and feel how sharply appetite wakes when someone else is cooking. A blacksmith's hammer rings like civilization itself. Flour can be replenished. A wheel rim tightened, a rumour gathered. Yet every stop risks expense, and expenses are watched with painful care. A family can admire a proper meal and still walk past it, chewing dry bread instead. Not all danger announces itself loudly. Illness travels with frightening ease. Bad water, spoiled food, exposure, exhaustion. And the close quarters of road camps make the journey fertile ground for stomach sickness, fever, coughs, and infant misery. A child grows listless by noon. A mother feels flushed at dusk. A father who has walked beside the wagon all day suddenly sits down too hard by the fire and says very little. That silence can scare a family more than any storm. On the road, there is no tidy sick room, no trusted physician nearby, and no guarantee that rest is safe to take. One common hardship is diarrhea, or what people might simply call bowel complaint. A dull phrase for a genuinely frightening problem when clean water is scarce. Dehydration can creep in fast, especially among children. People boil what they can, trust what they should not, and rely on remedies of varying usefulness. The medicine chest comes out with its bitter smells and unlabelled hopes. A spoonful here, a few drops there, perhaps a poultice, perhaps prayer, often both. Historians continue to debate how much roadside mortality was hidden by family silence in later memoirs. Many published recollections are stoic to the point of suspicion. Suffering was common. Details were not always preserved. Weather plays its own games. A hot day can roast everyone under canvas and wool. Sweat trickles down the spine, stings the eyes, and turns collars rough as rope. Thunderstorms burst from nowhere and flatten the world into wind. Cold rain and frantic covering of goods. Blankets get damp. Flour must be protected. Fire becomes difficult. Then there are nights when the air turns surprisingly sharp, and every gap in the bedding lets in a chill that seems personal. You learn to respect weather not as scenery, but as an active participant with poor manners. Camping each evening requires a practiced kind of exhaustion. First, the wagons are drawn up where ground is decent and water is near. If fortune allows, animals are unharnessed, watered, and perhaps tethered or yoked nearby. Then fires must be coaxed alive, food prepared, children wiped down as best as possible, and bedding arranged. Smoke curls through the dimness and clings to clothes. Bacon sputters in a pan. Cornmeal mush thickens slowly. Someone burns fingers on a pot handle because fatigue has worn down caution. Supper rarely feels elegant, but it feels profound. Warm food after a day of jarring motion can soothe a household better than any speech. Camp at night has a soundscape all its own. There is the low chewing of animals, the crackle of damp wood, a baby fussing once then drifting off, a spoon scraping the bottom of a kettle, men speaking in muted voices about miles and river levels, women folding the remains of the meal into cloth for morning. Beyond the small ring of light lie frogs, insects, night birds, and the wider dark. The frontier at night does not usually erupt into constant menace, despite later tales full of dramatic alarm. More often it surrounds you with uncertainty. You cannot see far. That is enough. Still, fear has reasons. Accidents happen easily in camp. A child can wander. A horse can break loose. A cooking fire can catch canvas or dry grass if care slips. Storm winds can scatter half the neat order created at dusk. Then there are stories, always stories, traded in low voices near the embers. Bandits on the road, wolves circling stock, a family taken by fever. Another turned back after losing 2 oxen and most of their flour in a river. Not every tale is true. Enough are true to keep everyone attentive. You also encounter traces of those who travelled earlier, wagon ruts hardened by old wheels, ash circles from abandoned camps, a broken chair leg, a dropped spoon, a strip of cloth caught on brush. The road accumulates evidence of other households inching toward the same uncertain hope. That can comfort you. It can also unsettle you. A discarded trunk board suggests haste or misfortune. A shallow grave by the roadside, sometimes marked and sometimes not, speaks more plainly than any sermon. A quirky but very real detail of road life is how quickly people become territorial about small comforts. One dry spot under the wagon, one less lumpy blanket, one section of shade at midday, one clean cup, a single onion kept aside for flavour. These modest treasures gather emotional force out of all proportion to their size. Civilized manners remain, mostly, but they are tested by dust, hunger, and repetition. On the road, characters revealed by who shares the last dry seat and who quietly takes it. There is also monotony, which is not dramatic but is deeply important. Day after day of creaking wheels, repetitive meals, mending harness, wiping dust, settling children, and watching the same wagon sway ahead can wear the spirit thin. The journey is not a string of grand events, it is a grind. That grinding quality shapes pioneer families as much as the more memorable dangers. Patience becomes a resource. So does humour. A well-timed joke about a mule's opinions or a wheel's talent for choosing the worst possible moment can keep a camp from souring. When the land opens into prairie or broad fields, the change can feel almost shocking after woods and narrow traces. Wind moves differently there. It passes over grass with a whispering rush, carrying warm smells of sun-dried plants and rich soil. The sky appears too large, almost impolite in its openness. Some travellers love the wide view at once. Others find it unnerving, as if the world has removed its walls. In timbered country, trees crowd close with shade, birdsong, and the damp scent of leaf mould. Each terrain asks for a different mood, and the road keeps teaching it. At last, after a long day, the body begins to accept discomfort as routine. You no longer react to every jolt. Dust becomes part of the skin. The wagon's groan becomes familiar enough to fade into the mind like a rough lullaby. That may be the strangest adaptation of all. Humans can grow used to astonishing inconvenience if the days repeat it often enough. The road remakes expectation. A stable bridge becomes a blessing. A level stretch feels luxurious. A dry camp can seem almost grand. And so you move westward by inches and endurance. Through ruts, storms, repairs, bad coffee, river crossings, stubborn livestock, and the long discipline of keeping a family together while the ground itself refuses to cooperate. The frontier journey is not glorious in the polished sense. It is noisy, dusty, anxious, and deeply physical. It asks for strong hands, steady nerves, and a willingness to wake each day and do again what was already hard yesterday. That is the real road. Not legend, just motion, discomfort, and the plain stubborn fact of continuing. Arrival is not the trumpet blast people imagine later. It is quieter, more tired, and much less flattering to the human spirit. You do not roll into a ready-made farm with a noble gaze and a glowing sunset behind you. You arrive dusty, stiff, underfed, and slightly offended by how little the landscape seems to care. The wheels slow, the animals lower their heads. Children stare from the wagon as if the earth might explain itself. It does not. It simply lies there in grass, timber, weeds, shadows and possibility, looking both generous and inconvenient at once. The first sensation is often silence, especially if you have come from a road crowded with other travellers. Not complete silence, of course. The frontier is never truly silent. Wind moves through tall grass with a dry whisper. Insects pulse in the heat. Birds call from treetops. Somewhere water may mutter over stones if a creek is near. But the human noise drops away. No blacksmith hammer, no church bell from the village green, no neighbour's cart rattling past the lane. The absence lands on the chest in a strange way. Freedom sounds lovely until you realise it also sounds empty. Now comes the work of choosing where life will happen. That choice matters more than any cheerful speech given back east. A family can survive with a rough wagon, patched clothes, and plain food, a badly chosen site, though, will harass them every day. Too far from water and every bucket becomes a trial. Too near water and dampness, insects, and sickness may settle in like unwelcome relatives. Land that looks level in evening light may turn swampy after rain. A pretty rise may expose a cabin to winter wind. Good timber, workable soil, drainage, access, and defensibility all matter. The frontier does not reward laziness in site selection. It punishes it with interest. You walk the ground carefully. The soil tells small truths if you know how to look. Dark, crumbly earth can promise good crops. Thin, stony patches suggest labour with poor reward. Prairie ground may be rich beyond expectation but difficult to break with a plough because of a dense root mats. Timbered land offers logs for building and firewood close at hand, though clearing it for crops demands brutal effort. Families often weighed these advantages according to their tools, livestock, and available labour. A household with strong sons and good axes might welcome timber. Another with limited manpower might prefer more open ground even if shelter materials are less immediate. Water is nearly everything. A spring is a blessing of the highest order. A reliable creek can serve well enough, though flood risk must be judged. Stagnant pools are suspicious, and with good reason. Many pioneer families did not understand disease in modern terms, yet they knew bad water had bad habits. A clear source near enough for daily use but not so close as to drown the yard in mud or fever feels almost providential. You kneel, cup the water, and feel its cold bite in the hand. It tastes of iron or stone or leaf shadow. You hope it will remain in August. Timberline and open field create another debate. Too many trees mean endless chopping before corn can grow. Too few trees leave you searching farther for cabin logs, fence rails, and fuel. In 1830, wood is not merely convenient. It is shelter, heat, tools, fencing, furniture, and cooking power. A family studies the stand of oak, hickory, walnut, maple, or poplar with something close to appraisal and prayer. Straight trunks a treasure. Deadfall helps. Brush is a nuisance until it becomes kindling. Then it improves in reputation. Boundaries themselves are often less neat on the ground than they seem on paper. A claim may be described in terms that feel satisfying in a land office and maddening in a field. Trees used as markers can be misread. Natural landmarks shift in usefulness depending on who is looking and how optimistic they feel. Survey lines exist, but confusion thrives at their edges. You begin to understand that claiming land is not only about possession, it is about interpretation, memory, an argument performed with very serious faces. This uncertainty can lead to disputes, some mild and some lasting. A neighbour may insist the corner lies a few rods farther north. Another may swear his fence follows the accepted line. Men pace off distances, squint towards stumps, consult rough papers, and speak with increasing conviction despite shrinking evidence. Historians still disagree over how often these early claim conflicts turn truly violent in ordinary frontier communities, because local records favour formal cases and miss many private settlements. What is clear is that boundary anxiety was common. Land represented survival, not decoration. A strip loss could mean less hay, less timber, less future for a child. Even before a cabin stands, the ground must begin answering human needs. Wagon unloading starts the transformation. Chests come down with thumps. Barrels are rolled carefully. Beds are set aside under temporary cover. Tools lean against a tree. The smell of trampled grass rises fresh and green beneath the feet. Canvas snaps in the wind. Children drift outward, then are called back sharply, because this is no place yet for careless wandering. The household spills onto the land in awkward clusters, half settled and half exposed. Temporary shelter becomes urgent. Some families camp beside the wagon for several nights while choosing and preparing a building site. Others throw up a brush lean-to or use a tent if they have one. In rain, the whole arrangement feels insulting. Damp creeps into blankets. Smoke refuses to rise properly. Clothing hangs heavy and cool against the skin. A child coughs in the night. The ground under bedding seems to grow lumps out of spite. This first stage of settlement is rarely heroic. It is transitionally messy and full of muttered opinions about weather. The land itself must be read almost like character. Where does the wind come from most strongly? Where does frost settle first? Which patch stays greener in heat? Are there signs of deer trails, wolf passage, or hog rooting? Does the soil crust quickly after rain? Can a wagon reach the chosen spot without bogging down? Families learned through experience and error, sometimes expensive error. A good site was not just pretty or convenient, it needed to function through seasons not yet seen. Prairie and woodland also carry different emotional effects. Prairie can feel magnificent in its breadth, wind rippling through the grass like water. It can also feel exposed, leaving the family visible from far off and far from shade. Timber offers enclosure, useful materials, and a sense of protection, yet dark woods can feel oppressive, especially to children or to adults listening at night to every branch knock and unseen movement. Settlers often preferred a balance, open enough for fields and light, wooded enough for fuel and construction. The ideal existed more often in hopeful conversation than in exact reality. A curious frontier truth is how fast beauty turns practical. A grove is lovely until you count how many trees must fall. A meadow glows in evening sun until you wonder whether it floods each spring. Wild grapes seem charming until you notice the tangle they add to already stubborn brush. Pioneer families could admire a landscape, but admiration had to share space with assessment. Beauty did not disappear, it simply had chores attached. There is also the legal side of settlement, which could be surprisingly muddy. Depending on place and circumstance, a family might purchase land through federal channels, settle near purchased land while improving it, rent, or occupy under arrangements that were not always settled in a final sense. Some occupied claims before perfecting title. Some purchased from speculators. Some joined networks of kin already nearby and relied on custom as much as paper. The frontier was full of formal policy and informal practice rubbing against each other like rough boards. That friction could shape community life for years. Women read the land too, though often through household needs men described less fully. Is there a place to wash? Will the yard turn to a bog? Can children be seen from the doorway? Is there room for a garden near the future cabin? How far is fuel in winter? Is the water source manageable with babies, laundry, and food preparation in mind? These are not small concerns. They are the architecture of daily endurance. A site praised by a man for its broad acreage may earn a much cooler verdict from the woman who imagines carrying 20 buckets uphill through February. Children react according to temperament. Some immediately treat the new place as an enormous invitation. They pick up feathers, chase grasshoppers, and inspect every stump as if they have personally been granted a kingdom of mud and insects. Others cling close to skirts or wagon wheels, unsettled by the lack of fences, familiar paths, and other human homes. Both reactions make sense. The frontier offers wonder and unease in equal measure. You can smell crushed weeds, warm earth, animal sweat, and distant wood smoke if another settler lives anywhere near. The air feels larger here, so do the uncertainties. First neighbours, when they appear, matter immensely. A rider comes through, a wagon from another claim rattles by, someone from a nearby cabin offers directions, local warnings, or advice on the best spring. These encounters can feel almost festive after the isolation of arrival. News travels in fragments. Which road is passable? Who owns the mill rights downstream, where fever was bad last summer? Which family has extra seed? Where the wolves have troubled the calves? Such information is social glue and practical survival wrapped together. Mainstream accounts of frontier settlement often celebrate the independence of the pioneer family, yet the reality is more mixed. Self-reliance mattered, certainly, but so did knowledge borrowed from others, labour exchanged between neighbours, and assistance given in moments of need. The myth of the completely solitary settler ignores how difficult true isolation could be. Even the proudest household benefited from local guidance, whether they admitted it or not. A family arriving in ignorance could lose weeks through avoidable mistakes. One rarely noted but revealing detail is that many first days on a claim involve not grand labour, but placement. Where will the kettle hang for now? Where should meal sacks stay driest? Which chest contains the axe heads? Which the blankets? Where can a child nap out of direct sun? Where should the animals be tethered so they do not tangle everything by nightfall? Before a farm becomes productive, it becomes arranged. Order comes in little islands first. A box here, a bedroll there, a line for drying cloth, a cleared spot for the fire. Civilization often begins with a place to set the spoon. The first fire on claimed ground carries weight beyond its warmth. Smoke rises into open air and marks intention. We are here. We will cook here. We expect morning. The smell of wood smoke settles into clothing and hair until the family itself begins to smell like the place. Bacon grease hisses in a pan. Cornmeal thickens. A child nods off before supper is ready. Hands are blackened with dirt from unloading and cutting brush. Faces show fatigue so deep it almost looks peaceful. As evening falls, the chosen patch of earth already starts changing in your mind. What was open becomes yard. What was tree line becomes future firewood, future fencing, future shelter. What was simply ground becomes field to be broken, garden to be planted, place for chickens, place for corn shocks, place where children may one day run without constant warning. Nothing visible has improved much yet. The land remains mostly itself. Still, the act of claiming has begun its quiet work inside the family, and that is the true beginning of frontier settlement in 1830. Not possession in the grand legal sense, not comfort, not success, but commitment made visible by where you stop the wagon, where you dig the first shallow trench for drainage, where you decide the door should face, where you trust the water, where you believe the soil might answer your labour. The frontier does not welcome you with ceremony. It waits to see whether you can read it well enough to stay. Shelter does not appear all at once. It begins as a clearing, a plan spoken over stumps, and the first sharp ring of steel biting into wood. You stand in raw ground where grass has been trampled flat and chips already scatter near the chosen site. The air smells green and wet from freshly cut timber, mixed with sweat, bark, and the faint smoky thread of a cooking fire kept alive nearby. This is where the family will sleep, cough, quarrel, mend clothes, say prayers, nurse fevers, and wait out storms. At the moment, though, it is only a patch of earth surrounded by trees that seem much too large for human ambition. Cabin building in 1830 is practical above all else. A family needs walls quickly, before weather or illness can take advantage of delay. The first structure is often small, far smaller than the later image of a rustic family home might suggest. One room is common. Sometimes a loft comes later, sometimes not. A beginning cabin may be roughly 16 by 18 feet, or even less, depending on labour, tools, and urgency. When you imagine several children, 2 adults, stored food, bedding, and household tools all inside that one room, the frontier begins to lose some of its decorative charm. Log selection matters. Straight trunks save effort. Trees too twisted waste time. Oak, hickory, chestnut, walnut, poplar, and pine may all be used depending on the region and what stands nearby. Green timber is heavy and wet, but often it is what the family has. The thud of falling trees becomes the soundtrack of these early days. First the axe chops in a measured rhythm, then faster, then deeper. Wood fibres split and groan. Leaves tremble. A final crack runs through the trunk like a warning, and the whole tree comes down with a ground-shaking crash that sends birds exploding from nearby branches. Children stare. Adults step back quickly. No one treats a falling tree lightly twice. Cutting enough logs for even a modest cabin is punishing work. Trees must be felled, limbed, trimmed to length, and dragged or rolled into place. Bark scrapes skin. Splinters slide into palms. Sweat stings the eyes and darkens shirts until cloth clings cold when the wind shifts. The touch of rough bark against the shoulder, the ache in the lower back, the shock of a log slipping unexpectedly in your grip. All of it teaches the same lesson. Shelter has a weight to it, a very literal weight. If neighbours are near, a cabin raising may bring welcome extra hands. Such gatherings could be a form of mutual aid and social obligation wrapped together. Men lift and fit logs. Women often help feed the workers, manage children, and handle countless tasks that keep the day moving. There may even be moments of rough good humour, jokes traded over the heavy work, teasing about who miscut a notch or who thinks a wall stands straight when it clearly leans like a tired preacher. These events could carry a festive feeling, but they were not parties in the light sense. People came because one day they might need the same help. When help is scarce, the work slows and grows more dangerous. A father and older sons may manage much themselves, but every raised log becomes a test of leverage and nerve. Poles, skids, and sheer stubbornness replace manpower where they can. The cabin rises one layer at a time, log laid on log, corners joined by notches cut to lock together. Good notching matters. A poor joint invites shifting, wind, and endless annoyance. You run a hand along a freshly cut notch and feel the ridged marks left by the axe. Clean work gives a small thrill. Sloppy work means cold drafts later and perhaps much muttering in January. The floor is often an afterthought at first, which sounds alarming because it is alarming. Some early cabins begin with packed earth underfoot. More substantial floors are made from puncheons, thick slabs of logs split and hewn flatter on one side, then laid side by side. They are better than dirt, yet no one would mistake them for smooth indoor luxury. Bare feet learn that quickly. Puncheoned floors can be uneven, splintery, and full of cracks where crumbs, dust, and every tiny object a child drops will disappear forever. Still, compared with open ground, they feel magnificent. The walls themselves are only part of the shelter. Spaces between the logs must be filled by chinking and daubing. Small pieces of wood, stone, or wedges are fitted into gaps, then covered with a mixture that might include clay, mud, moss, straw, or animal hair, depending on local practice and available materials. It is messy work. Hands are coated, knees sink into damp earth. The smell is rich and mineral, cool and sticky as the mixture is pressed into seams. Done well, it slows drafts and keeps out at least some weather. Done badly, it drops into your bedding with every hard rain. Historians still debate how durable these early mixtures really were in everyday use, because surviving descriptions vary so widely by region and season. What is certain is that maintenance never ended. Roofing brings fresh difficulties. Clapboards or shakes split from logs can be used, weighted down with poles if nails are scarce. Some roofs are better than others in exactly the way umbrellas are better than hats during a storm. You can be grateful and still get wet. A badly fitted roof turns rain into a household event. Drips appear over the bed, over the meal sack, over the one dry shirt you wanted to save. The entire family becomes sensitive to cloud behaviour. A dark sky overhead is no longer weather. It is a structural critique. Then there is the door, usually simple and made from boards or split slabs if proper sawn lumber is unavailable. Hinges may be iron, or a wooden latch arrangement may do the work. The door matters symbolically more than people might admit. A wall keeps out wind. A door creates the feeling of inside and outside, of home and not home. At night, when it closes against darkness, the cabin finally begins to feel less like a construction project and more like protection. Not perfect protection, let us not flatter it, but enough. Windows, just when present at all, are often small. Glass may be scarce or too costly to waste on generous openings. Oiled paper, cloth, shutters, or simply an opening that can be closed in bad weather may have to serve. That makes the interior dim. Daylight enters in a narrow, hard-working way, falling across the table, catching smoke, glancing off a kettle, then leaving corners in shadow. By evening, firelight does most of the labour. It softens the crude surfaces and makes the cabin seem warmer than it really is. Smoke also softens things, mostly by getting into your eyes. The fireplace is the heart of the cabin, and also its resident troublemaker. Building it takes stone, clay, and luck, or logs plastered with mud in rougher early versions. A chimney might be made of stick framing covered in clay, sometimes called a mud and stick chimney, which sounds temporary because it often was. Fireplaces provide heat, light, and a place to cook, but they also smoke, crack, draw badly, and occasionally remind everyone that fire is both servant and threat. The smell of smoke seeps into blankets, hair, flour, and the very grain of the walls. Your clothes become walking evidence of the hearth. Cooking inside the new cabin is an education in improvisation. Pots hang from hooks or cranes if such fittings exist. Skillets balance over coals. Ash settles where it pleases. The room warms on one side and stays chilly on the other. A loaf baked in a Dutch oven can seem like civilization returning by stealth. Grease pops. Steam rises. The children hover too near the fire until shooed back. One pot, one flame, one room, and suddenly domestic life begins to gather around the centre like iron filings finding a magnet. Beds are usually simple frames or improvised arrangements made from poles pegged into the wall. Rope support, straw ticks, quilts, and blankets. Some sleep on trundles or pallets laid out at night and packed away by day. Privacy is nearly non-existent. Every cough, sigh, dream mutter, and restless turn belongs to the entire family. Babies wake everyone. Snorers become public nuisances. A child with growing pains flings one heel into a sibling before dawn. In such cramped quarters, affection and irritation live side by side like uneasy cousins. Furniture comes slowly. Stools, a table, shelves, pegs for hanging clothes, perhaps a chest serving 3 purposes at once. All may be built from local wood with simple tools. The first pieces are often sturdy rather than graceful. A chair that does not wobble is a triumph. A shelf that keeps meal away from mice earns real admiration. Beauty exists, but it tends to arrive later, after the family has secured food, warmth, and the basic ability to sit down without incident. The cabin changes the sound of life. Outside, the world remains broad with wind, axes, birds, insects, and distant animal calls. Inside, sounds become intimate and amplified. Rain drumming on the roof, fire ticking in the hearth, a spoon against a wooden bowl, boots thumping on puncheon boards, a baby breathing softly after finally giving in to sleep. The close room collects these sounds and holds them, making the household feel compressed, but undeniably together. Smell is part of the architecture too. Fresh split wood gives a resinous sweetness at first. Clay daubing smells damp after rain. Smoke clings always. Add wet wool, drying herbs, bacon grease, lamp tallow, leather harness, and unwashed socks after a week of labour, and the result is not exactly a perfume salon. It is, however, the smell of habitation, of people holding a line against weather. A frontier cabin announces its purpose through the nose before the eye fully understands it. Life inside is shaped by compromise from the first day. The cabin is warmer than the wagon, drier than the tent, safer than open sleeping, and still full of inconveniences that would horrify anyone attached to spacious living. Vermin may find their way in. Drafts snake through gaps. Tools lean where they should not. The family must cook, eat, sleep, mend, pray, and store possessions in a room too small for such ambition. Yet human beings are remarkably good at domesticating difficulty. A peg added here, a curtain hung there, a better shelf, a tighter seam, a fresh layer of daubing, and the place slowly shifts from shelter to home. Women often bore much of the burden of that transformation. They arranged the interior, established the rhythms of cleaning and cooking, found where to keep precious dry stores, and created order where the structure itself offered very little help. A man could boast that he built the cabin, and perhaps he did raise its frame, but a house becomes livable through repeated acts of care that are quieter and less celebrated. The placing of bedding away from drafts, the hanging of herbs where they might dry, the saving of scraps for patching, the keeping of a fire through a wet evening. These are not decorative gestures, they are a system of endurance. A quirky frontier detail is that walls sometimes became storage by necessity and whim alike. Rifles, hats, herbs, strings of drying apples, bundles of corn, tools, clothing, and even bits of meat might hang overhead or from pegs, turning the cabin into a vertical puzzle of household economy. You lift your head and see life suspended above you, practical and slightly threatening. One badly placed skillet can remind a person to duck faster in the future. Winter reveals every flaw, summer heat reveals the rest. In cold weather, the family crowds close to the hearth, while the far side of the room seems to belong to another climate entirely. In warm weather, the cabin traps smoke, odours, and body heat with almost personal hostility. Doors stand open when possible. Flies accept the invitation enthusiastically. Rain turns the yard to churned mud. Snow works into cracks. Wind whistles where daubing failed. The cabin is never finished in any final sense. It demands constant attention, patching, rethinking, improving. And yet, despite its roughness, the cabin offers something emotionally powerful. It is evidence that the family has stayed long enough to put walls between themselves and the open dark. Evidence that labour can become structure, that trees become shelter, that raw land can be persuaded, however reluctantly, to hold human life. At night, when the fire burns lower and the room glows in restless orange light, the cabin seems to gather the family inward. Outside is vastness, weather, uncertainty. Inside is cramped, smoky, and alive. It is not comfort in the polished sense. It is comfort earned by hand, log by log, seam by seam, until the frontier finally gives way to a door you can close. Once the cabin stands and the claim feels real under your boots, the frontier reveals its favourite rule. Nothing stays done. A tree felled means branches to clear, stumps to reckon with, wood to split, and tools to sharpen for the next tree. A meal cooked means pots to scrub, grain to grind, more fuel to fetch, and another meal approaching with quiet confidence. Life on the American frontier in 1830 is not made of grand heroic moments strung neatly together. It is made of labour that returns every morning, waits in every season, and fills nearly every waking hour. You rise early because the work prefers it. Before sunrise, the cabin is dim and cool. The hearth must be stirred back to life from embers hidden under ash, if fortune and care kept them alive overnight. The room smells of smoke, stale wool, damp leather, and yesterday's supper lingering faintly in the corners. Someone coughs. Someone groans softly before sitting up. Outside, the air can feel raw against the skin, wet with dew or already close with heat, depending on the month. A rooster may crow if the family has poultry yet settled enough to object to dawn. If not, the first sound is often an axe being lifted. Men's labour is often described first in old frontier stories because it is louder and more visible from a distance. You hear the axe strokes, the crack of splitting rails, the plough dragging through hard ground, the grunt of lifting sacks or logs. Clearing land is one of the great tasks. Timber must be cut, brush piled, roots fought, stones moved, and the field somehow transformed from promise into something a crop will tolerate. Breaking new ground can feel like arguing with the earth itself. The plough bites, jolts, and catches. Roots snag the blade. Animals strain. The soil turns in stubborn lumps. Sweat runs down the back and soaks the waistband. By noon, a man may look as if he's been rolled in dust, bark, and anger. Yet the household does not run on male labour alone, or even mainly, if you count the true number of essential tasks. Women's work is constant, varied, and frequently performed without the dignity of being called skilled, though it plainly is. Water must be carried, meals planned and cooked, bread mixed and baked, clothing washed, dried, mended, and remade, babies nursed, toddlers watched, chickens fed, herbs dried, milk skimmed, butter churned, soap managed, candles saved, bedding aired, garden rows weeded, fruit preserved when available, illness observed, family morale, though no ledger records it, is also part of the work. A woman's day can splinter into 30 necessary acts before breakfast settles in anyone's stomach. Children work too, and not merely in the charming storybook way of carrying one stick and feeling useful. Frontier children are folded into the labour system as soon as they are physically able. A small child may gather chips for kindling, scare birds from the garden, mind a younger sibling, fetch eggs, or carry water in a little pail that still feels terribly heavy after the third trip. Older children hoe, plant, milk, spin, card wool, ride for help butcher, lead animals, and stand in for adults where they can. Play exists, but it shares space with duty. Childhood on the frontier is not stolen exactly. It is simply expected to contribute. The seasonal rhythm governs everything. Spring can be frantic with ploughing, planting, repairs, lambing or calving, and the general effort of outrunning time. Delay a planting, and the consequences may visit at harvest with icy precision. Summer brings weeding, fencing, haying, garden labour, mending, and the heavy tiredness of working long in heat, while insects perform their own campaign against human patience. Autumn carries harvest, food preservation, firewood cutting, slaughtering, and preparation for cold. Winter, though it can look quieter from a distance, remains full of hauling, feeding stock, repairing tools, spinning, sowing, shelling corn, tending fires, and trying not to burn through supplies too soon. Food work alone can occupy astonishing amounts of time. Grain does not become dinner by wishful thinking. Corn must be shelled and ground. Meat must be salted, smoked, or cooked before it goes bad. Vegetables must be dug, washed, chopped, dried, or stored. Milk must be handled quickly before warmth turns generosity sour. Bread requires mixing, kneading, tending heat, and a little luck. Even coffee, or something pretending to be coffee, requires effort. A kettle hissing at the hearth is the end of a chain of labour involving fuel, water, vessel, fire, and someone too sleepy to enjoy any of it properly. Laundry is another frontier epic disguised as routine. Water must be hauled and heated, clothes sorted, scrubbed, boiled if needed, wrung or rinsed and hung. Soap can sting cracked skin. Wet cloth is heavy enough to make your arms ache. In cold weather, fingers go numb. In hot weather, the whole process takes place under a sun that seems personally offended by your existence. Clean clothes are a triumph, but a temporary one. Within hours, children kneel in dirt, men sweat through shirts, and smoke settles into everything again. Civilization makes a brave effort. The frontier answers with mud. One of the most exhausting jobs is fence building. It sounds dry until you imagine what happens without it. Animals wander, crops are damaged, boundaries blur, trouble starts. Split-rail fences require felling timber, cutting rails, hauling them, and stacking them into zigzag lines over a remarkable amount of ground. The rails are rough, heavy, and often slightly inclined to punish fingers. But a fence means order. It means your corn stands a chance. It means the pig belongs outside the turnips, which is a distinction the pig may not appreciate, but the household certainly does. Gardens often sit near the cabin and provide a vital buffer against hunger and monotony. Beans, cabbage, onions, pumpkins, squash, peas, and herbs might grow there depending on climate and luck. The garden is frequently the domain of women and children, though not exclusively. Its work is constant and unglamorous. Weeds arrive with insulting confidence. Insects help themselves. Hens scratch where they should not. Drought threatens. Too much rain threatens differently. Yet when a family can pull onions from the ground, cut greens, or gather beans, the meal table brightens in ways difficult to overstate. Livestock adds another layer of unending duty. Cows need milking. Hogs need feeding or at least watching if they range. Chickens drift into absurd places and lay with deliberate secrecy. Horses and oxen require care because they are not only animals, but power sources. A sick animal can mean lost labour, lost food, or lost transport. The smell of animals settles into the yard and often into the cabin's orbit as well, mingling with hay, manure, warm hides, and fermenting feed. It is not an elegant scent. It is the smell of a household trying to remain alive through winter. Tools demand attention too. Axes must be sharpened, handles repaired, plough parts checked, hoes straightened, knives honed. A dull tool wastes strength, and strength cannot be squandered freely when every muscle is already booked for the week. Frontier labour includes maintenance of the means of labour, a mildly cruel arrangement if you think about it. The axe makes work possible, then asks for work itself. Few things on the frontier are content to be merely used. There is a mainstream historical truth that bears repeating in a new light. Many pioneer families lived very close to subsistence. Even when they owned land, that ownership did not guarantee comfort. A bad harvest, an injury, a lingering sickness, or the loss of an animal could push a household into genuine crisis. Ownership gave independence, yes, but it also concentrated risk within the family. There was no large cushion under most pioneer lives, only skill, effort, neighbours when available, and whatever reserves had not yet been consumed. At the same time, frontier work was not only toil without variation, there could be pride in competence, a straight furrow, a newly cleared patch of field, a stack of split firewood rising higher by the wall, a shirt neatly mended so well the tear almost vanishes, butter set properly, soap made that actually works instead of merely smearing disappointment across a shirt. Small successes carried emotional weight because they proved the household was mastering at least some corner of its environment. You feel this in the body as much as in the mind. Tiredness mixed with satisfaction has a texture all its own. Quirky little details of labour survive in memoirs and recollections. People complained about stumps with nearly poetic bitterness. They hated them in the field, around the yard, underfoot, under plough, and in principle. A frontier landscape half cleared and full of stumps could look, one observer said, like a gathering of ugly wooden teeth. It is hard not to admire the accuracy. Stumps catch wheels, twist ankles, mock ploughmen, and remain long after the tree has been triumphantly cut. The frontier had a special gift for leaving the hardest part behind. Work days often stretch from grey dawn to near dark. But they are not one seamless heroic performance. They pause, reshape, and break under necessity. A child is hurt. Rain interrupts. A hen goes missing. The fire dies. Someone must ride to a mill or a neighbour's place. Bread burns because the baby cried, and then the dog stole what was salvageable. Human life keeps inserting itself into labour, and labour keeps swallowing human life in return. That back and forth defines the household more than any single chore. Religion and labour often sit close together here. Morning prayer, grace at table, a muttered appeal when lifting something too heavy, a psalm hummed during washing, all weave belief into work rather than setting it apart. Many frontier families understood labour not simply as necessity but as moral duty. Idleness was suspect. Improvement was virtuous. To keep a decent household under hard conditions carried spiritual meaning as well as practical value. Of course, a woman elbowed deep in laundry water may have felt more soap than theology in the moment, but the framework mattered. Scholars still argue over how much frontier labour actually differed in intensity from hard rural life in older settled regions. Some point out that farm work was punishing almost everywhere in the 19th century. Others emphasise that new settlements piled land clearing, construction, and fragile infrastructure on top of ordinary rural demands, making the burden unusually heavy in the first years. Both arguments contain truth. What seems clear is that pioneer families felt the frontier as relentless, because so many systems had to be built from scratch, while daily survival continued without mercy. There is also emotional labour, though no one in 1830 would have called it that. Somebody must keep children from despair on rainy days. Somebody must soothe tempers when a crop fails in one patch and the fence falls in another. Somebody must remember birthdays, however quietly. Somebody must make the cabin look less like a storage shed and more like a place where people belong. Often that somebody is a woman, though not always. Frontier endurance is not just muscles and acreage. It is the repeated act of preventing a hard life from turning mean. By evening, the whole family carries the day in the body. Shoulders droop, hands are nicked, reddened, or stained. Clothes smell of smoke, sweat, livestock, and earth. The supper table, whether a proper table or a board balanced into usefulness, becomes a place of brief stillness. Spoons scrape bowls, bread passes hand to hand. Children fade into silence or sudden giggles from simple tiredness. Firelight softens faces worn by the day. Outside, frogs call from wet ground, insects sing, and the last light settles behind the trees or over the open field in a haze of gold and dust. Then there are the tasks before sleep, animals checked once more, fire banked, wet items brought in or shifted, tomorrow's meal considered, a torn cuff set aside for mending, a tool left ready by the door. The frontier adores tomorrow's work so much that it begins arranging it before today is fully ended. You lie down with muscles humming, not quite pain and not quite rest, while the cabin holds the warmth of people who have spent themselves honestly. That is the deepest rhythm of work from dawn to dark on the 1830 frontier. Every member of the family is drawn into a web of necessary labour. The tasks differ by age, strength, skill, and custom, but the demand is shared. Survival is not a dramatic event. It is a system. It is wood chopped before breakfast, shirts mended after sunset, fields cleared inch by inch, children carrying water with both hands, and women holding together the daily machinery so quietly that later generations sometimes missed how much depended on them. The frontier could make a household proud, tired, hungry, capable, irritable, and fiercely attached to the fruits of its own labour, all in the same day, usually before supper. By the time evening gathers around the cabin and the day's labour loosens its grip on your shoulders, food becomes more than food. It becomes proof. Proof that the family managed another day, that the stores have not yet failed, that the fire still burns, and that hunger, though always waiting nearby, has not taken the best seat at the table. On the 1830 frontier, meals are never only about taste. They are about season, luck, labour, weather, storage, hunting, and the stubborn art of making plain ingredients feel like comfort. The table itself may be little more than a set of rough boards or a slab balanced into service, but once bowls, spoons, and a steaming pot appear, the place takes on a gravity of its own. You smell cornmeal thickening near the hearth, bacon grease warming in iron, onions softening if any have survived the season, and smoke drifting through everything with the confidence of an uninvited guest who refuses to leave. Children edge closer. Adults move with a tired economy. No one wants long speeches before supper. The spoon is already halfway to the bowl in everyone's imagination. Corn sits at the centre of many frontier diets because it is adaptable, productive, and forgiving in ways that can feel almost merciful. Cornbread, mush, johnny cakes, hoe cakes, hominy, and meal cooked into whatever shape necessity allows all appear again and again. Wheat bread exists when flour is available, but many families rely more heavily on corn because it grows well in many frontier regions and can feed both people and animals. A warm piece of cornbread, coarse and fragrant, broken open with a little butter if fortune is feeling generous, can feel almost luxurious when the day has been long and the future uncertain. Salt pork is another regular presence, carried from stores, cured at home, or stretched with impressive determination. Its smell can fill a room quickly. Rich and fatty and impossible to ignore, it flavours beans, it seasons greens, it lends authority to a pot that might otherwise taste like boiled discouragement. Bacon and cured ham serve similar roles when available. Fresh meat, by contrast, is more irregular. Unless an animal has just been butchered or game brought in recently, meals often lean on preserved protein and whatever the garden or woods can supply. Beans deserve their share of respect. They store well, fill the stomach, and can be cooked slowly while other work continues. A pot of beans by the fire offers a kind of dependable companionship, bubbling away while chores press on. Add pork, onion, and a pinch of salt, and the household begins to smell not merely fed, but anchored. Add nothing but water and patience, and the result is still valuable. Frontier cooking often rests on this principle. It may not be glamorous, but it keeps the body moving. Wild game can add welcome variety, though not always in the tidy abundance later stories imply. Deer, rabbit, squirrel, wild turkey, ducks, and other birds may appear depending on region, season, skill, and luck. Hunting supplements the table, but it is not a magical answer to every food problem. Game is not evenly available. Ammunition costs something. Time spent hunting is time not spent clearing, fencing, or planting, and success is never guaranteed. Still, when a rabbit hangs near the door or venison simmers in the pot, the mood improves almost immediately. The smell alone can make a hard cabin feel briefly festive. Fish also enter the diet near streams and rivers, though again, opportunity depends on place and knowledge. A good catch can brighten a day, especially when other supplies run thin. Fried in fat or stewed simply, fish can bring a cleaner taste than the usual heavy reliance on pork and corn. Yet fish can also spoil quickly, smell strongly, and contain enough bones to make supper feel like a quiet exam in concentration. The frontier gave gifts, but rarely without some practical condition attached. Vegetables from the garden add colour and relief: cabbage, turnips, beans, pumpkins, squash, onions, peas, potatoes where they grow well, all help hold hunger at bay and break the monotony that salted meat alone would create. Pumpkins and squash are especially valuable because they keep reasonably well and can be used in several ways. Greens gathered young from garden rows or nearby wild patches bring freshness after too many heavy meals. A pot of stewed pumpkin, a pan of fried potatoes, even a few roasted onions can change not only the plate but the spirit. Fruit is more uncertain and often more seasonal. Wild berries, crab apples, plums, or orchard fruit from older settlements or developing homesteads may appear when the land and weather permit. Dried apples, if packed carefully or preserved later, become treasured winter additions. Apple butter, preserves, and pies exist, but each requires both ingredients and the precious time to make them. A child handed a dried apple ring in cold weather may react as if presented with treasure, and in a household of limited sweets, that is not far from the truth. Sugar itself is often limited. Molasses may serve when it can be afforded or obtained. Maple sugar and syrup matter in some regions. Honey appears where bees cooperate. Sweetness is not absent from frontier life, but it is measured. Desserts exist, yet not as daily expectations for most pioneer families. A little sweetness after supper can feel ceremonial. It says that life is not entirely made of necessity. It says there remains room, however narrow, for pleasure. Coffee occupies a special place in imagination and memory. Real coffee was loved where available, but it was not always easy to obtain or replenish regularly. Some frontier households stretched supplies, while others turned to substitutes made from roasted grains, chicory, or other local improvisations. These beverages did not always convince the tongue, but they warmed the body and allowed people to pretend for a moment that deprivation had not fully rearranged their standards. Frontier households were skilled at practical self-deception of the most useful kind. Meals followed the clock of labour rather than the clock of leisure. Breakfast might be early and simple, perhaps mush, bread, leftover meat, or whatever could be managed before the day's serious work began. Midday food was often practical and hurried. Supper, taken after chores eased, carried the most emotional weight. The family gathered, the day slowed enough to notice one another. Even a sparse meal felt richer for being shared in relative stillness. The scrape of spoons, the hiss of the fire, the smell of warm meal and smoky fat, all settled into the memory of what home meant. But the frontier table also held anxiety. Food stores were counted, barrels were watched. A sack of meal growing visibly lower could change the mood in the room. The approach of winter sharpened every calculation. Will the smoked meat last? Has enough corn been stored? Did the garden fail too early? How much can be traded at the mill? Can hunting make up the difference? Hunger does not need to arrive fully to cast a shadow. It often enters first as arithmetic. Bad harvests were a real and recurring threat. Too much rain could rot crops. Drought could stunt them. Insects might strip leaves. Animals could break through fences and do an astonishing amount of damage in a short time. Seeds might fail. Illness at planting time might delay essential work. A single missed window in the agricultural year could echo all winter. The romantic image of the hearty pioneer feast belongs partly to truth and partly to selective memory. Plenty happened. So did scarcity, and scarcity left deeper marks. When stores ran low, meals became thinner. Beans were stretched with more water. Meat was used for flavour rather than substance. Cornmeal took centre stage with almost comic persistence. Coffee disappeared or became a rumour. A little lard or drippings might transform plain food into something tolerable, but even fat could not always be spared freely. In such times, the sound of a pot simmering might offer comfort while the contents offered only modest strength. People ate what they had, then imagined what they preferred. Children felt these shifts immediately. They noticed when portions shrank, when butter vanished, when the cheerful possibility of a sweet treat did not materialize. They also noticed adults pretending not to worry. A mother may smile while scraping the last of something precious into the pot. A father may say little and chew slowly. Frontier households often practiced a quiet theatre of reassurance around food, especially for the young. Adults carried the fear in the pause before serving themselves. Women's labour at the hearth shaped survival in ways easy to overlook. Cooking on the frontier was not simply following familiar recipes, it was adaptation under pressure. How do you bake when flour is low? What can replace what is missing? How long can milk be kept in this weather? Which greens are safe? How do you preserve fruit before it spoils? How do you feed a household after a failed hunt? Such knowledge was practical intelligence of a high order. A capable frontier cook was part chemist, part manager, part magician, and probably too tired to enjoy the compliment. Preservation became one of the great arts of the year. Meat might be salted or smoked, fruit dried, vegetables stored in root cellars, pits, or cool corners when available. Herbs hung from rafters, corn shelled and kept as dry as possible, beans dried hard for later use. Cabbage might be stored or fermented depending on habit and circumstance. Every preserving task fought the same enemy: time. Fresh food has a brief and beautiful life. Winter is much longer. The smells of preserving season could define a household. Smokehouse air thick with meat and salt, apples drying sweetly, vinegar biting the nose, herbs releasing sharper scents as they hang from beams, boiling fruit fogging a window. These smells signalled diligence and hope. They meant that the family was trying to outrun future hunger by capturing present abundance. Some days the cabin could smell almost generous. Still, not every comforting food memory from the frontier involved plenty. Sometimes comfort came from repetition itself. The same bowl, the same wooden spoon worn smooth by use, the same place by the fire where the bread was set to cool, the same small ritual of a parent dividing the last good piece fairly. Familiarity can soften hardship, even when hardship remains quite busy. A child may remember the taste of hot mush and milk, not because it was splendid, but because it arrived with warmth and safety. Quirky food habits existed too. People used all sorts of substitutes and local improvisations that later generations would find inventive or mildly alarming. Sassafras tea, parched corn snacks, vinegar sweetened as best as possible. Pumpkins standing in for ingredients it had no right to replace. All could appear. Frontier cooks were deeply pragmatic. If something edible could be transformed into something filling, the transformation would be attempted with determination and not a little optimism. Historians continue to argue over exactly how monotonous pioneer diets were across different regions and classes. Some evidence points to more variety than the old stereotype suggests, especially where hunting, fishing, and trade offered supplements. Other evidence emphasizes just how repetitive meals became in difficult seasons or isolated settlements. Both patterns likely existed. The frontier was too broad and too uneven for one menu, yet nearly everywhere, food remained tightly tied to labour, weather, and storage. Choice was limited, appetite was not. There is also the social side of food. Neighbours might share yeast, swap seed, exchange cuts of meat after slaughtering, or gather for corn huskings, raisings, and other communal tasks where food took on a celebratory role. In those moments the table widened. More voices filled the room or yard. Laughter rose with the steam. Ordinary dishes tasted better because they were eaten among company, rather than under the hush of worry. A communal meal could remind a family that frontier life was not only endurance, but fellowship. And yet the smallest comforts were often the most precious. A heel of bread toasted near the coals, a cup of something hot on a wet morning, a pat of butter melting into cornbread, a handful of berries, a slice of pie on a Sunday or holiday, the touch of a warm bowl in cold hands, the smell of onions and pork after a day in the wind. These things did not erase hardship. They made it bearable. That is what food meant for pioneer families on the American frontier in 1830. It was fuel, worry, ritual, memory, discipline, invention, and occasional delight. It could swing from hearty to thin with unnerving speed. It reflected the land's generosity and its indifference at the same time. Around the rough table, with smoke in the rafters and hunger held just far enough away for one more night. A family did more than eat. It gathered itself back together, spoonful by spoonful. Frontier life often gets told through the loudest labours. The axe stroke, the plough, the wagon, the rifle hung by the door. But the quieter burdens inside a pioneer family could be just as heavy, and often more constant. You feel that truth most clearly when you look at the work carried by women and children. Their labour is everywhere at once, spread through the cabin, the yard, the garden, the path to water, the cradle, the wash kettle, the loom, the meal pot, and the long patient hours that hold a household together. It is work so continuous that it can disappear into the background unless you stop and notice the human cost. A frontier woman wakes into responsibility before the room is fully light. The fire must be coaxed up again, breakfast begun, water fetched or checked, children roused, dressed, soothed, or directed. The cabin air in the early morning smells of ash, damp wool, and breath, with a chill that lingers close to the floor. A baby may already be fussing. A toddler may have kicked free of blankets. Someone needs stockings found. Someone else has a cough that sounds worse than yesterday. Even before the first pot hangs over the flame, the day has made its demands. The work is not only numerous, it is layered. A woman might stir mush while nursing an infant, keep one eye on a child too close to the fire, think ahead to bread needed by noon, remember linen soaking for washing, and quietly worry about the dwindling salt barrel all at once. Domestic labour on the frontier is less a sequence than a weaving. Pull one thread and 5 others tighten. There is rarely a moment when only one task is present. The mind itself becomes a kind of workbench. Pregnancy and childbirth make this burden sharper. Many frontier women bore children repeatedly, often under physically punishing conditions and with limited medical help. A woman might be heavily pregnant while carrying water, churning, gardening, and caring for several children. She might give birth in a cabin still half unfinished, with only female neighbours, if any, are near, or with none at all beyond her husband's anxious awkwardness. The room would be warm from the fire, thick with the smell of sweat, damp linen, and smoke, while outside ordinary chores waited with complete indifference. Birth on the frontier was ordinary in frequency and extraordinary in risk. Recovery from childbirth could be brief because necessity rarely allowed otherwise. Rest sounds noble, but cows still needed milking and children still needed feeding. A mother may have gone back to work far sooner than comfort or health advised, simply because the household had no spare pair of hands. This is one of the hidden truths of frontier endurance. The body was expected to continue because there was no acceptable alternative. Strength was admired, but often it was not chosen so much as demanded. Women also managed a vast amount of textile labour, spinning, weaving where possible, knitting, sewing, mending, cutting garments down for younger children, patching work clothes, turning old cloth into quilts or rags, and preserving every scrap that might be used later, all formed part of the household economy. Fabric did not appear by magic at the frontier store shelf. Even purchased cloth had to be made to last. You can hear the soft pull of thread through cloth in the quieter parts of evening, the small snip of scissors, the rustle of the worn garments turned in lamplight and judged for one more repair. Clothing carried family dignity, warmth, and health. Keeping it serviceable was not decorative work. It was survival with a needle. Laundry alone could consume a woman's strength. A wash day meant hauling and heating great amounts of water, scrubbing cloth against boards or by hand, boiling what must be boiled, wringing heavy fabric, and hanging or spreading it to dry where weather allowed. In cold months, the steam from hot water fogged the cabin and dampened the air. In warm months, the sun beat down while insects found every exposed inch of skin. Hands cracked. Backs ached. The reward was temporary cleanliness in a world committed to producing fresh dirt by sunset. Children, meanwhile, occupied an uneasy space between dependence and usefulness. Very young children required constant oversight, because the frontier was full of hazards. Fires, open water, tools, animals, snakes, sharp corners, wagons, and simple distance itself could all become dangerous quickly. A mother could not watch every child every second. yet she had to try while doing everything else. That tension shaped daily life. It made patience precious and interruptions relentless. As children grew, expectation followed close behind. Little girls might help mine babies, carry chips, gather eggs, shell beans, card wool, or learn to sew almost as soon as their fingers could manage it. Boys might fetch water, drive cows, chop small wood, scare birds from the corn, or run errands to a neighbour. The exact division varied by family and region, but the principle remained steady. A child able to help was expected to help. Work taught skill, but it also taught obedience and endurance. There was affection in these households, certainly. There was also little room for idleness. Schooling on the frontier could be irregular. Some communities established small schools once enough families gathered and someone could be found to teach. Before that, education often happened at home if it happened at all, squeezed between chores and seasons. A child might learn letters from the family Bible, arithmetic from practical counting, and geography from the shape of the road, and the names adults spoke with longing. Many parents valued education deeply, but Labour did not politely step aside to make room for reading. A school term could be missed for planting, harvest, sickness, weather, or distance. Childhood intelligence had to survive in the cracks left by necessity. Play still lived there. It had to. Children chased each other around stumps, rolled hoops, carved whistles, made rag dolls, waded in creeks, invented games with corn cobs, sticks, stones, feathers, and pure imagination. Laughter on a frontier farm could rise suddenly and brightly, startling in the middle of all that labour. Yet even play often happened near work, or was interrupted by it. The same child who was inventing a kingdom in the yard might be called a minute later to gather kindling or hold a baby. Joy was present. It was simply less protected. The emotional life of women on the frontier is harder to recover because so much of it went unwritten, or was later polished into dutiful silence. Some letters and diaries reveal loneliness so sharp it almost vibrates on the page. A woman might miss sisters, mothers, old neighbours, church company, familiar roads, and the ordinary comfort of another adult woman dropping by without occasion. Isolation could weigh heavily, especially in early settlement before a strong network formed. The cabin, for all its importance, could also become a trap of endless repetition and limited conversation. Marriage itself was tested by this environment. A husband and wife depended on each other intensely, yet they might also be exhausted, worried, and pressed by different burdens. Men could underestimate domestic labour because it left fewer dramatic marks on the landscape. Women could resent decisions that had placed them in harsher conditions with less support. Arguments about money, crops, livestock, children, distance from neighbours, or whether moving west had been a terrible idea could all flare under strain. The frontier did not create marital tension from nothing, but it gave tension plenty to work with. At the same time, tenderness survived in small acts. A husband bringing in extra wood before a hard freeze, a wife setting aside the best bit of supper for a child who looked pale, an older sister braiding a younger one's hair by the door in evening light, a mother humming while she rocks a baby, though she's almost asleep herself, a father carrying a child who fell asleep on the stool before supper ended. These gestures mattered because they softened a life that could otherwise turn purely mechanical. A mainstream historical fact worth holding steady is that women's work on the frontier was economically central. It was not merely supportive of male farming labour, it produced clothing, food, preserved goods, dairy products, candles, soap, and household order. In many homes, a woman's skill determined whether the family remained healthy, respectable, and resilient through difficult seasons. The old story that puts men in the realm of production and women in the realm of home simply does not fit frontier reality. The home was a site of production, constant production. There were also older women and girls whose labour bridged generations. Grandmothers, when present, could provide childcare, herbal knowledge, food preparation, and memory of how to manage hard seasons. Teenage daughters often carried astonishing loads of responsibility, sometimes functioning almost as second mothers. They cooked, cleaned, tended younger children, made clothes, worked in gardens, and helped nurse the sick. Frontier families depended heavily on this chain of female labour, though later heroic stories often gave the spotlight elsewhere. Illness exposed hidden burdens even more clearly. When someone fell sick, women usually became the first line of care. They sat up through the night, changed cloths, boiled water, dosed bitter medicines, soothed frightened children, cleaned up after vomiting or fever, and still tried to keep ordinary life moving. The smell of sickness in a one-room cabin could be oppressive, sweet and sour at once beneath the smoke. Sleep shrank. Fear grew. Yet even then, the chores did not vanish. They merely crowded closer. One curious frontier detail is how often women had to improvise tools, remedies, or substitutions from whatever sat at hand. A broken button became a tie. A worn shirt became diapers or patches. Grease became medicine or lamp fuel depending on need. A sack became an apron. Nothing useful was merely discarded if it could be transformed. This household ingenuity is easy to romanticize, but in practice it arose because cash and supplies were too scarce for waste. Resourcefulness was admired because shortage required it. Historians still argue over whether frontier life gave women more autonomy or more oppression, and the answer seems to be an untidy mix of both. In some settings, women exercised real influence because their labour and judgment were indispensable. Distance from older communities could relax certain social expectations. At the same time, the physical burden, repeated pregnancies, legal limits, and household dependence could make life harsher and choices narrower. Freedom on the frontier was never distributed evenly. It often arrived wrapped in extra work. Children too lived in this tension. Frontier childhood could offer unusual competence and closeness to nature, and a sense of being genuinely needed. It could also bring danger, grief, hard labour, and responsibilities far beyond modern expectations. Some children remembered these years with pride. Others remembered fatigue, fear, or loss. Many likely remembered both. Human memory is generous that way, storing warmth beside strain. Social moments were precious, partly because they relieved these hidden burdens. Quiltings, church meetings, visits from neighbours, berrying trips, or shared work gatherings allowed women conversation and mutual support. Children found playmates, news travelled, recipes, remedies, and advice were exchanged along with gossip and comfort. A woman who had endured weeks of near solitude might feel almost lightheaded with relief at hearing another adult voice speak casually in her kitchen or yard. Community was not a luxury, it was medicine of a kind. As night falls, the burdens do not disappear. They simply soften at the edges. A child finally sleeps with one hand open over the blanket. Another leans against a mother's shoulder, warm and heavy with fatigue. The fire settles into red coals. The cabin smells of smoke, wool, dried herbs, milk, and the day's work still clinging to skin and cloth. Someone mends by low light. Someone whispers a prayer. Someone sits in silence because silence is the only thing left to manage. That is what women and children reveal about frontier family life in 1830. The household depended not just on the strength that could clear land, but on strength that could repeat small necessary acts without applause. It depended on mothers carrying too much, daughters learning too early, boys working before they stopped being boys, and children finding little flashes of play inside a life built around labour. The hidden burden was not truly hidden from the people living it. They felt it in their backs, their hands, their interrupted sleep, and the constant turning of care into action. Yet within that burden lived resilience, tenderness, and a stubborn domestic courage that kept the frontier from becoming only hardship. Even the most self-reliant frontier family cannot live entirely alone for long. The cabin may stand apart, the fields may stretch quiet around it, and the nearest smoke from another chimney may be a small grey thread on the horizon. But human beings keep reaching for one another. You feel that truth most strongly when the work eases just enough for voices to gather. A neighbour arrives on horseback. A wagon appears at the lane. Someone calls from outside before stepping in. The sound of another adult voice, after days of wind, tools, and family routine, can feel almost startling in its richness. Neighbours on the frontier are not merely pleasant company. They are insurance, they are witness, labour reserve, information network, emergency aid, marriage market, gossip line, and moral audience all at once. A family may prize independence, but when a cabin must be raised, a sickness worsens, a horse goes missing, or a child is injured, independence quickly reveals its limits. Then the value of nearby people becomes plain. You smell coffee or wood smoke in a neighbour's cabin, hear the scrape of chairs and the low murmur of conversation, and realise that community is one of the few frontier resources that grows stronger when shared. Some of the most important gatherings revolve around work. A barn raising, corn husking, hog butchering, quilting, or log rolling turns labour into a social event without making it less laborious. Men lift beams, set posts, or wrestle with timber while women prepare food, organise children, and often contribute substantial work of their own. The yard fills with motion, tools, laughter, advice, and the kind of teasing that keeps heavy jobs from becoming grim. There is noise everywhere. Axes ring, hammers knock, a kettle lid chatters, chickens flee in outrage from boots and wagon wheels. For a few hours, a scattered settlement takes on the energy of a village. These work gatherings could be exhausting, but they offered something precious beyond practical help. They reminded families that they were not carrying every burden alone. A woman who has cooked only for her own household for weeks may suddenly find herself among other women exchanging recipes, childbirth stories, sewing advice, and the latest local news while stirring a pot or slicing bread. Children run in packs, louder and dirtier than seems possible, inventing games around stumps, sheds, and fences. Young adults notice one another in ways their parents notice very carefully indeed. Community does not arrive in polished civic form. It arrives carrying logs, spoons, and opinions. Church gatherings often anchor frontier social life as well. A proper church building may not exist at first. Worship might happen in a cabin, a schoolhouse if the settlement has managed one, or outdoors in fair weather. The setting is plain, yet the emotional force can be strong. You hear hymn singing rise without polished accompaniment, raw and earnest and fuller than the small room seems able to hold. Boots scuff the floorboards, babies fuss and are hushed, the smell of wool, damp cloaks. Tallow and human closeness fills the air. For many families, these moments do more than affirm belief. They restore order. They place private hardship inside a larger frame of meaning. Religion on the frontier can be stern, comforting, emotional or practical, often all in one morning. Ministers may be itinerant, appearing only occasionally, or local lay leaders may guide prayer and scripture reading when clergy are absent. Sermons can emphasize sin, perseverance, humility, or divine favour, depending on tradition and temperament. Some gatherings carry the weight of revival feeling, with intense conviction and open emotion. Others are quieter, the kind of Sunday steadiness that keeps a family attached to familiar forms in an unfamiliar land. Either way, faith gives many pioneer households language for hope, sorrow, labour, and loss. Of course, where people gather, gossip follows like a loyal little dog. Frontier communities are small enough that almost every private event acquires public edges. Who lost a cow? Who bought more land than he could afford? Whose daughter has been seen walking with which young man? Who let a fence go slack? Which family still owes for milling? Who drinks too much whiskey after dark? Gossip can wound, amuse, regulate, and protect all at once. It spreads through visits, church meetings, work bees, and store counters, stitching the community together with equal parts information and mischief. The frontier store, if one exists within reach, becomes another social centre. It sells necessities when stocked, disappointment when not, and conversation always. Men may linger over prices, politics, weather signs, and stories carried in from elsewhere. Women, though often less free to linger, gather news there too when able. Children absorb the atmosphere with bright eyes and inconvenient hands. The smell of molasses, leather, tobacco, flour dust, and iron goods creates its own frontier perfume. A store is part market, part bulletin board, part rumour mill, and part theatre where local reputations are constantly revised. Courtship also unfolds within these social spaces. Frontier life is hard, but young people remain stubbornly interested in one another, which is perhaps the healthiest fact in all of human history. A singing gathering, a husking, a Sunday meeting, or a family visit can provide chances for glances, jokes, and supervised conversation. Marriage on the frontier is practical in many ways, tied to labour, land, fertility, and household formation. Yet affection and attraction are not absent. A young man who can handle stock well and speak kindly to children may look very promising indeed. A young woman known for competence, wit, and steady temper may attract notice quickly. Romance survives even among mud, smoke, and seed sacks. Still, social life on the frontier is never all warmth. Fear moves through it too, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a sharp edge. Storms are among the most universal fears. A black sky gathering over open land can change the whole mood of a household in minutes. Wind lifts dust from the yard and slams the door. Rain hammers the roof. Lightning shocks the cabin white for an instant, and then leaves the room darker than before. Trees can fall, streams can rise, fences can vanish into splinters by morning. A family that has worked for months to establish order may lie awake, listening to weather rearrange it by force. Fire is feared with equal reason. In a world of wooden cabins, open hearths, candles, dry roofs, and stored fuel, one careless moment can threaten everything. The smell of smoke is normal on the frontier, which makes dangerous smoke all the more treacherous. A spark in the wrong corner, a chimney drawing badly, a child too near the hearth with a stick. Any of these can push ordinary life toward catastrophe. People watched fires closely because they had to. Fire cooked the meal and warmed the room. It also waited for opportunity like a very patient enemy. Accidents in general haunt frontier life. An axe slips, a horse kicks, a child tumbles near the well, a man is pinned beneath a log, a woman burns her hand badly lifting iron from the coals, a snake surprises someone in high grass. These are not exceptional events in a dramatic sense. They are ordinary risks intensified by distance from trained help. A deep cut or broken bone means pain, lost labour, and uncertainty for the whole household. When neighbours come running in such moments, their presence can feel nearly miraculous. There are deeper fears too. The kind families speak of less directly. Fever in late summer, a cough that lingers into cold weather, childbed complications, food running low before spring, a husband away overnight who does not return on time, a cow failing in winter, a crop damaged just enough to create doubt but not enough to justify despair. Frontier fear often lives in the middle range. Not the grand disaster, but the persistent possibility that one more setback will tip the household into real hardship. Settlers also carried unease about encounters beyond their immediate community. In some regions, fears about conflict with native peoples remained strong, especially where dispossession and migration had recently reshaped the landscape. Those fears were often exaggerated through rumour, yet they also existed within a real history of violence, removal, and contested land. Frontier families sometimes lived amid stories they only partly understood, benefiting from expansion while also fearing the instability that expansion created. The emotional reality could be confused, defensive, and morally tangled. It is important not to smooth that complexity into a bedtime myth of simple innocence. Likewise, the frontier included crime, though often less in the constant dramatic form later fiction prefers, horse theft, petty fraud, whiskey trouble, disputed claims, and occasional violence could unsettle communities. The fear of lawlessness sometimes mattered almost as much as actual lawlessness. In a thinly settled district, a stranger asking too many questions might receive long, careful looks. Dogs barked, rifles were checked, doors were latched more deliberately. People learned quickly who belonged, who could be trusted, and who might be watched from the corner of the eye. Scholars still debate whether frontier communities were more cooperative or more suspicious than older settled ones, because evidence supports both impressions. Mutual aid was essential and often generous. At the same time, thin resources, uncertain boundaries, and weak formal institutions could sharpen conflict and caution. A neighbour might help raise your barn one week and quarrel bitterly over a hog or a line fence the next. This is not hypocrisy so much as the frontier's way of compressing dependence and tension into the same human relationships. People needed one another too much to avoid friction. One quirky but revealing habit in small settlements was the intense circulation of weather signs and omens. The ring around the moon, the behaviour of chickens, the sudden silence of birds, the smell in the air, the ache in an old injury, the direction of the wind at dusk, all could spark confident prediction. Some of it was practical local observation, some of it drifted toward folklore. Either way, people listened. On the frontier, the weather had such power over crops, travel, safety, and comfort that even doubtful signs earned respectful attention. Children absorbed the community's atmosphere through all of this. They learned which houses felt welcoming, which dogs bit, which adults told long stories, which ones smelled of pipe smoke and sternness, and which paths were safe after dark. They attended preachings, ran wild at gatherings, watched adults lower their voices over grave matters, and sensed fear before it was fully explained. A child's frontier world could be both wider and more intimate than modern life, full of open space yet densely mapped by reputation and memory. Evenings after a visit often leave a curious feeling in the cabin. The room seems quieter than before, because it has recently held more voices. Cups sit unwashed, a bench is slightly out of place. Children replay games or gossip while drifting towards sleep. Adults review what was learned, who is ill, who is planting late, who may come help next week, whether the preacher is expected again soon, whether the storm farther north damaged the mill bridge. Social life may appear simple from the outside, but it carries information that shapes survival. When fear presses hardest, community becomes most visible. A sick child brings neighbours with broth, herbs, prayer, or the simple willingness to sit up through the night. A death gathers women to wash and lay out the body, men to build the coffin and dig the grave, families to bring food because grief does not cancel hunger. A storm loss may bring borrowed tools and extra hands. The frontier can be isolating, yes, but in its best moments it also teaches how deeply human beings are built for one another. That is why neighbours, faith, and fear belong together in the life of pioneer families. They are three threads in the same rough cloth. Neighbours offer practical help and social relief. Faith provides language, ritual, and courage in uncertainty. Fear sharpens attention to the fragile edges of daily life. Together they shape a world where a cabin stands alone but not entirely alone, where the dark outside the window feels less overwhelming because other lights burn somewhere beyond it, and where survival depends not just on what a family can do by itself, but on who answers when it calls. By now, the frontier has shown you its true face often enough that no one in the cabin can mistake it for an easy dream. The land can be rich and stubborn at the same time. The weather can nourish crops one month and threaten ruin the next. A roof can shelter and still leak. A field can promise much and deliver modestly. Every gain has been paid for with sore hands, lost sleep, worry, and repeated acts of endurance so ordinary they almost disappear from memory while they are happening. And yet many pioneer families in 1830 stayed. Not only stayed, but rooted themselves deeply enough to call the struggle worthwhile. That is the puzzle resting quietly at the heart of frontier life. Part of the answer lies in ownership. Land changed the meaning of hardship, labour done for wages on another man's farm, or rent paid year after year for ground that would never be yours, carried one feeling, labour done on your own, claim carried another. You step outside in the morning, smell wet soil and wood smoke, and look over a field that answers, however imperfectly, to your household. It may be half cleared and full of stumps. The fence may lean. The corn may look uneven in one row and promising in the next. Still, it is yours in a way that matters down to the bone. Ownership does not soften the work, but it gives the work a shape that feels morally satisfying. That satisfaction can be hard to explain to anyone who has not lived close to dependence. A family that has spent years under debt, rent, cramped inheritance, or insecure tenancy may feel a fierce relief in even rough possession. Your cabin stands on your land. Your children run across your yard. The smoke rising from your chimney does not mark another man's prosperity. It marks your own uncertain, but genuine stake in the world. For many frontier settlers, that was enough to redeem a great deal of discomfort. Not all discomfort, naturally. Let us not get silly, but a great deal. There is also pride in visible improvement. Frontier life rewards the eye with evidence of progress, even when progress is slow. A patch once tangled in brush now holds corn. A raw cabin now has shelves, a proper latch, maybe even a second stool. The yard is less wild. The garden rows stand straighter. The woodpile is higher. A fruit tree planted small enough to look ridiculous has somehow survived another season. These changes are not grand in the language of empires, but to a pioneer family they can feel magnificent. They prove that labour has not vanished into the air. It has settled into form. Children are central to this sense of purpose. Much frontier striving is aimed past the parents themselves and toward the next generation. You hear it in the way adults talk about future acreage, future marriages, future inheritance, future schooling if a school can be established within reach. A father may endure years of brutal clearing because he imagines his sons ploughing easier ground after him. A mother may preserve, patch, scrub, and save because she wants her daughters to begin adulthood with more security than she had. The frontier often asks one generation to suffer, so another might stand on firmer ground. This ambition is not purely material. It also carries moral meaning. To leave children land, or at least the possibility of land, meant leaving them independence. In a culture that prized self-command, household authority, and visible diligence, this mattered enormously. The dream was not merely that children would eat better, though that mattered too. The dream was that they would begin life with a chance to answer to themselves. Even families who never became prosperous in any grand sense could still take pride in pushing their children one step farther from dependence. Hope worked hand in hand with memory. After enough seasons, hardship itself could begin to change shape inside recollection. The worst days did not vanish, but they sat beside the better harvest. The healthy calf, the first apples, the roof finally kept dry through a storm. The winter survived with food still in store. Human beings are gifted at making meaning from effort, especially effort they cannot undo. A frontier family that had paid dearly to stay was naturally inclined to believe staying had been worthwhile. This was not always self-deception. Often it was the honest recognition that a hard-won life can still be a good one. The land also offered a powerful illusion, and sometimes a reality of social mobility. In older, more settled places, class lines could feel heavy and inherited. On the frontier, a man with energy, skill, luck, and a little capital might enlarge his standing over time. He might acquire more acreage, build a better house, increase stock, send children to school, or enter local leadership. Success was far from guaranteed, and failure remained common, but possibility itself had force. The frontier sold not comfort but chance. For many families, and chance was enough to keep them anchored. Women's reasons for staying could be equally strong, though often less publicly celebrated. A woman might come to value the authority she exercised within her own household economy, the garden she shaped, the dairy she managed, the order she imposed on rough circumstances, the children she was helping raise into capable adults, and the community of neighbouring women she slowly built from scratch. Frontier life burdened women heavily, but it could also give them a sphere of indispensability no one around them could honestly deny. A woman who had made a raw cabin livable had every reason to take pride in what she had created. Even if she was too practical to call it pride, community helped turn endurance into belonging. A place stops feeling temporary when neighbours know your name, when someone borrows your auger and returns it late, when your children argue with other children over nothing at all, when hymn singing sounds familiar, when local gossip begins to bore you because it is too well known, when the graveyard on a rise holds people your family loved. At that point, staying is no longer a simple economic calculation. It is attachment. The frontier ceases to be a project and becomes a home, with all the stubborn loyalty that word carries. A mainstream truth about American frontier settlement is that many families did in fact move again. Some sold out and went farther west. Some failed and returned east. Some were pushed by debt, exhaustion, poor land, or simple disappointment. The frontier did not hold everyone. Yet many who remained did so because the costs of leaving again could feel worse than the cost of staying. Once a family had built, planted, buried, married, and adapted, departure meant tearing up more than fences. It meant tearing up identity. Settlers could become attached not just to success, but to the version of themselves that had survived hard country. There is something else too, something quieter. Hardship can simplify purpose. Frontier life stripped away many illusions while leaving a few strong ones in place. Feed the family, keep the roof sound, raise the crop, guard the stock, help the neighbour, save seed, bury the dead, welcome the newborn, prepare for winter, begin again. Such a life was exhausting, but it also carried a kind of clarity many more comfortable worlds do not. There is relief in knowing exactly what matters today. Even when what matters is difficult, that clarity could make ordinary pleasures shine more brightly. A cool breeze after heat, a harvest brought in before rain, a Sunday shirt still white enough to wear with dignity, a child laughing over something absurd in the yard, a kettle of apples simmering, the smell of fresh-cut hay, snow outside while the fire holds steady within. These pleasures did not appear despite frontier hardship, but partly because of it. Scarcity sharpened appreciation. A small good thing arrived with full emotional weight. Some settlers also stayed because they had nowhere better to go. This is important to say plainly. Not every decision to remain came wrapped in noble purpose. Some families lacked the money to move again. Some had invested too much to retreat. Some were aging. Some were trapped by circumstance, injury, or grief. The frontier could become home by commitment, by love, by pride, or simply by lack of alternatives. Human motives rarely line up in clean rows. They bunch together like tools in a corner, useful, tangled, and a little dusty. The wider national story fed these private choices as well. In 1830, westward expansion was not only a family matter, it was tied to national ambition, government policy, transportation changes, land sales, speculation, and the displacement of native peoples. Many settlers understood themselves, consciously or not, as part of a larger movement that cast expansion as progress. Historians continue to argue over how deeply ordinary pioneer families embraced this ideology versus simply using the opportunities it created. Most likely the two blended. People followed household needs while also absorbing the language of destiny, improvement, and growth circulating around them. The moral cost of that growth cannot be ignored. Families who stayed and prospered often did so on land opened by dispossession, coercion, or removal. They could be hard-working and sincere and still benefit from injustice larger than their own cabin walls. Frontier endurance was real. So was the violence woven into expansion. Holding both truths together makes the story more honest, if less comforting. History often asks for that kind of balance, and the frontier especially so. There were also symbolic rewards to staying. The first orchard tree bearing, the first real surplus sold, the first frame addition to the cabin, the first time a traveller stops and asks directions as if your homestead were now a fixed point in the world. These moments tell a family that they are no longer merely surviving a place, they are shaping it. The frontier becomes less a raw edge and more a settled pattern, because households like yours remain long enough to make roads, churches, mills, schools, and neighbourhoods thinkable. A quirky truth of a frontier memory is that people often remembered early misery with surprising fondness. Once comfort increased even slightly. The leaking roof became a story. The terrible first winter turned into proof of character. The dinner of nearly inedible corn cakes became family legend retold with laughter. Memory softened edges and burnished endurance into identity. This was not falsehood so much as emotional thrift. If you had survived so much, of course you wanted it to mean something honourable. Children raised in such households absorbed that meaning. They learned that effort changed landscapes, that wants could wait, that family labour was shared, that property was earned through care as much as purchase, and that comfort was fragile but buildable. Some would later reject frontier hardness and seek easier lives. Others would repeat the pattern and move onward themselves. Either way, the values of endurance, thrift, competence, and guarded optimism ran deep. The frontier was not just a place, it was a schooling of temperament. In quiet moments, you can sense why staying mattered beyond all practical explanations. At dusk, the field lies still except for insects and the low shifting of animals. The cabin door stands open to release the day's heat. Smoke rises in a straight thin line because the wind has gone soft. The soil smells warm. The boards at the threshold are worn where feet have passed 1,000 times. Here is the child you carried. Here is the tree you planted. Here is the patch of wall you repaired after the storm. Here is the cup hook you drove into place. Here is the life you made by hand. However rough, human beings attach themselves to the things they have shaped. That may be the simplest answer of all. So pioneer families stayed for land, for children, for pride, for belonging, for hope, for habit, for lack of alternatives, and for the fierce satisfaction of seeing effort become permanence. They stayed because the frontier, once survived long enough, could stop feeling like a test and start feeling like a claim, not just on the map, but on the self. It demanded everything. And that demand itself gave the life a stern kind of meaning. Now the night grows gentler around the cabin. The tools are quiet. The animals have settled into their own soft movements and warm breathing. Inside, the fire has fallen from bright flame to a low red glow, steady and watchful. The room carries the mixed scent of smoke, old wood, wool blankets, and the last trace of supper fading into the dark. Voices soften. Even the floorboards seem less inclined to complain. You let the day unfasten itself slowly, one thought at a time. Outside, the sky stretches wide above the fields and trees, calm at last, with stars laid over the frontier like pale grains scattered by a patient hand. The rough road, the labour, the weather, the worry, all of it begins to recede into a softer distance. You can imagine the land resting too, as if the stumps, fences, rows, and cabin walls have all agreed to be still until morning. The family draws close in sleep, gathered under quilts and dim light, held by the shelter they built and the life they kept, and as the air cools and the embers settle further into ash, you drift with that quiet scene. The field no longer asks for work. The bucket waits by the door. The kettle hangs ready for dawn. Nothing needs to be solved right now. The frontier, so demanding by day, loosens its grip at last and becomes only darkness, breath, and the low, safe murmur of home. You rest there for a while, in that hush, where effort has turned into belonging, and the long, hard edges of the world grow soft enough to sleep beside.